Thank you very much, Jacob. So, hi, everybody. Actually, that transition that Jacob gave, talking about the Stop SLF website, is kind of what gets us here today. That website was funded by a large USDA NIFA Specialty Crops Research Initiative grant that we were awarded in 2019 to study impacts and management of spotted lanternfly in specialty crops in the Eastern U.S. That grant is wrapping up. I've been leading that grant with a lot of other collaborators, all listed on that website. And what we learned in that grant is that while lanternfly feeds on a lot of different things, you heard from Dr. Holly Shugart yesterday, all of the different things that it feeds upon and could have impacts upon as it spreads, as it expands its range. Basically, what we know is that to date, the largest impacts are in grapes. And so we're pursuing funding. We have, a grant, another SCRI proposal presently under review at NIFA, but we're focusing our work on grapes because the biggest impacts has been on grapes. And so what we've learned about lanternfly management in grapes has really focused on those regions that have had the longest lanternfly infestation. And so that's been southeastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, a little bit of Northern Virginia and Maryland and whatnot. And what we know with spotted lanternfly is, as it expands its range, even feeding on grapes, the impacts might change. And so lanternfly is not yet in the grape growing region around Lake Erie, nor yet in the Finger Lakes, and it's just starting to move up the Hudson Valley. But what we know about grape production, particularly if we focus on that Lake Erie region of Pennsylvania and New York, is that grape production is completely different there. There's a lot of grapes that are produced for juice, not wine. The vineyards are much bigger, and so basically what we did last year was we had a panel that was led by two members of our Lake Erie Regional Grape Extension team at Lake Erie. That's a joint facility. It's a joint Penn State and Cornell facility. And so we had Megan Luke and Jennifer Russo lead a panel that had cooperators on it. We had a representative from Welch's. We had a representative from Gallo, and we had an individual who grows grapes for nursery, as nursery stock for others to grow. And what we learned there is that there's a lot of differences, not just in terms of how grapes are grown, but in terms of the impacts lanternfly might have. And so with that, basically that was an information gathering meeting. Their biggest concern was if they use mechanized harvesting, if lanternfly gets caught up in the mechanized harvesters, how much lanternfly is enough to cause a load to be rejected when you take it to, Welch's or Gallo and, to deliver your grapes. And so that inspired a lot of action that we've all taken this last year. You heard Brian Walsh's presentation on Tuesday in terms of the study that we conducted that he led that looked at what's the worst case scenario, what happens if grapevines are not sprayed and they get harvested with lanternfly and a mechanized harvester. That also inspired a number of meetings. We've been on May 1st, again, our Lake Erie team led an in-day, in-person event at a vineyard that was really well attended, where a lot of us talked, researchers and extension folks from Penn State and Cornell, gave updates, let those growers know the latest and greatest in terms of, where we're at with lanternfly research and management information. That meeting was great. We also heard from Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. We had APHIS there. So we had a lot of the right people in the room to for us and the regulatory agencies to better understand what the impacts might be, what are those growers' concerns so that we can better respond to it. Pennsylvania Department of Ag is also, they're all over, performing surveys. They have thousands of survey points that they've dropped in that region so that they are very aware of when lanternfly gets there. It's just pushing at the edges. That has also inspired a lot of informal conversations, but also New York State IPM. Brian Eschnauer and Jacob led a meeting with New York growers in Marlborough. So just in the Hudson Valley where I-84 just hits the thruway. That's kind of, it seems, where lanternfly is right now, to hear from growers in that region. And so that all started with that panel where we hear directly from the stakeholders, what are you worried about with lanternfly, that can trigger those events. And so now as we see spotted lanternfly expanding its range more into the Southeast, it's kind of butting kind of right up against some of the more of the vineyards in Virginia. And so we have concerns there about what might be additional impacts of lanternfly in those regions. Again, grapes are grown differently. There's different environmental pressures there. And so what we did is we said, let's have another grower panel this year that's focused on that region. And so with that, basically, I asked a colleague, Dr. Drew Harner, and I'll introduce him here in a second and hand it off to him. But Drew Harner, his official title, he's a faculty member at Virginia Tech. He's an assistant professor of viticulture and extension specialist. He's just finished his first year at Virginia Tech. Drew did his PhD dissertation research on spotted lanternfly and its impacts on grapes, working as earning his doctorate from Penn State under the supervision of Michaela Centenari. He also did a postdoc with Dr. Christina Rosa, who's a plant pathogen expert working on lanternfly. And now he's in this position working directly with the growers in Virginia. And so we asked Drew if he would be so kind as to lead a panel where we hear from growers in the Southeast today. And so with that, Drew, I will hand it off to you if you're ready to go.
Yes, I am. Thanks, Julie. That was a wonderful introduction. And I appreciate both you extending this invitation to me, as well as our other fellow panelists, and organizing this. I'm excited to be here, and hopefully some of the things we share in the next hour are both insightful for anyone attending this call, and also maybe just sort of give you an idea of what we're facing here in the Southeast. So yeah, as Julie mentioned, I'm Drew Harner. I'm an assistant professor of viticulture here at Virginia Tech, located at a fruit research station in the far north of Virginia. So sort of the top of the triangle of Virginia, if you will. Yeah, and I've been here for about a year. So we have a team of people here today with us that I would like to maybe just go through and introduce. And we could have them, maybe we could have you guys just unmute and maybe you turn your video on and just sort of give a quick introduction about who you are, because we have fellow panelists from Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia. So sort of representing sort of the Southeast, or at least a few states in the Southeast. So we'll start with Virginia. I introduced myself, but Mizuho, if you wanted to say hello.
Hi, my name is Mizuho Nita. I'm an associate professor at Virginia Tech, stationed at the same location as Drew. We are at Winchester, Virginia, and I'm a grape pathologist here.
Thanks, Mizuho. Yes, and thank you for clarifying where we are. We're in Winchester, Virginia. So if you're familiar with Virginia, Blacksburg is the main campus for Virginia Tech in the southwest corner. Okay, so let's go to North Carolina. We can start with you, Lexi.
So I'm Lexi McDaniel. I'm at NC State. I'm located in Raleigh, but I serve as a viticulture specialist for the whole state. I work in tandem with Dr. Mark Kaufman, so I'm part of the viticulture extension team here.
Thanks, Lexi. Amy?
Hi, I'm Amy Michael. I'm the state regulatory entomologist for the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. So we handle a lot of the detection and mitigation efforts for spotted lanternfly in our one population in the Piedmont. But we also serve the entire state and have a wide range of different grapes and different kinds of concerns for spotted lanternfly that I'm happy to talk about today.
Thanks, Amy. And then let's switch to Georgia. Let's start with Sarah.
Hey everybody, I'm Sarah Louder. I'm the extension viticulturist for UGA based out of Athens. They're also serving the whole state.
Thanks, Sarah. Brett.
Hi, I'm Brett Blau. I am the extension specialist for fruit entomology. So I cover insect pests of a variety of fruits, including wine grapes and muscadines.
Thanks, Brett. And then Phil, we'll finish with you.
Yeah, Phil Brandon, again, University of Georgia in plant pathology. And so I cover grapes as one of the commodities that I have interest in.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, thanks to you all for being here. So as Julie mentioned, the original planning, we had wanted to incorporate more growers into the panel, but because of the nature of sort of how lanternfly is spreading in the Southeast and how it's still getting sort of a foothold in some of our southern states, I thought it might be most helpful to have the specialists who work with the grape industries in each state come on, and we'll just have sort of a roundtable discussion about considerations of host plants, different species of host plants in the South that we may need to think about in terms of spotted lanternfly management, different sort of management regimes for insect pests already, and also the diseases that they can potentially vector that are more prevalent in the South and Southeast, and some other topics as well. So I guess let's kick it off with other insect pest management. So in Virginia, even though I guess technically we're part of the Southeast, we're also part of the Mid-Atlantic. We do have resident spotted lanternfly populations that are actively infesting vineyards year after year. Last year really seemed to be the year where growers were seeing the most, I think, since infestation started a couple years ago. At least that's what I really heard of as a viticulture specialist. So we have to worry about spotted lanternfly management in the spring and fall, but also in our southern vineyards within Virginia, sharpshooter management. And that's one of the first things I guess we'll kick off is with sharpshooters, and sort of how growers in different states are managing sharpshooters, and if those are the main insect pests that you're managing for in North Carolina and Georgia. So I guess anyone from North Carolina want to chime in first?
Yeah, I can. So it's definitely for insects in the Piedmont area and in like lower elevations for wine grapes. It's going to be for the sharpshooters, and those are quite heavily applied insecticides. Not heavily, but like they definitely use up what the label rates can be, because that is a big concern. If you go, farther east, we have muscadines, which insecticides are really only applied for, I think, grapefruit borer. But I think now we have mating disruptions or mating disruptions. So not too much of a insecticide application there. And then if you go into the mountains, so that's even farther western North Carolina into the higher elevations, they're starting to maybe see more increased in Pierce's disease, or insects, I should say, but infections haven't become systemic there. They'll randomly see it here and there depending on the winter. But yeah, so it is definitely sharpshooters are mostly the main concern I see.
And Lexi, is that mostly early season? Or are you
Yeah,
also
so
applying late season?
They're doing early season, and they'll continue maybe like with some contacts here and there later, but it is that early season population that they're trying to get.
Okay, thank you. And just to I guess for us to back up a quick second, so thinking about sharpshooters, for those of anyone on the call, the attendees who might not know what insects we're referring to, we're referring to a couple different species of sap-feeding insects. And any of my panelists, please just jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, since you all may have some more experience with me. than me. But my understanding is that they're mainly sap feeding coming in from the woods. And the reason we're concerned about them is because they can possibly transmit Pierce's disease, which is a vascular disease caused by Xylella fastidiosa. Is that correct? Brett, I see you nodding your head. Okay. Okay, cool. So how many species of sharpshooters are you looking for then, or are growers managing for? Anyone can chime in on this one too.
Well, Brett can probably chime in on that, but there are quite a few. I think the one we're most concerned about has always been the glassy wing sharpshooter, but in North Georgia, North Carolina, a lot of the smaller sharpshooters are very active, and they transmit Pierce's disease as well. So I know Brett's done surveys, and so in Georgia, but I know I've seen some of the surveys from North Carolina as well. And I think we have kind of the same situation. If you go to South Georgia, the glassy wing is predominant, but it's not that prevalent in North Georgia and probably in North Carolina. Brett, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so glassy wing sharpshooter was also one of our largest sharpshooters. It's nearly a ½ inch, which is a pretty hefty size for a bug. And they are notorious for spreading the Xylella to the vines, especially in California. But here in Georgia, they are predominantly in the southern part of the state. Whereas if we get into the northern and upstate, as well as Tennessee and North Carolina, and I know South Carolina as well, they're not as prevalent. And so it is some of these smaller sharpshooters. And the most common one that we found here is the pursuit sharpshooter. That one's almost a ½ inch. It's kind of a tiny little bug, but it's very colorful. So it's actually easy to detect on a sticky card or something. But that's really the one that's most common that can also transmit Xylella. So that's the one that we're looking for here in Georgia. But there are nearly a dozen species that it can be found that can potentially transmit Pierce's disease.
I'll just make a comment too on these smaller sharpshooters. What we see is they feed on the periphery kind of the shoots, and we found out through trial and error, I guess, as we've watched things over time, that we do prune out a tremendous number of the infections that we have, because the bacteria that causes Pierce's disease does not actually make it down into the cordon. And so just the act of pruning, when you have the smaller sharpshooters, will get rid of a lot of the bacteria. One of the concerns we've had with the glassy wing sharpshooter is because it's a larger sharpshooter, it can feed lower down on the shoots. And if in fact we are going to have a spotted lanternfly infestation that could potentially increase Pierce's disease with the feeding, because it seems to also, based on what I can tell, feeds lower. That is potentially a major concern for us. It's not just the act of killing the grapevine outright, but also if there is transmission of this bacteria. And I know that's still kind of on the edge of the knowledge we have, but if that does occur, even if it's relatively low rates, I think it will be a problematic issue for us.
Thanks, Phil, for that comment. That's where I wanted this particular segment to go. So as Phil mentioned, there's ongoing research looking at Pierce's disease transmission in grapevines being performed at Penn State. Some of the preliminary work from a few years ago showed a potential for transmission. As I'm understanding it, a relatively low percentage of transmission. It's not necessarily, a really fine-tuned transmission system compared to maybe the glassy wing sharpshooter and Pierce's disease. But thinking about when we have really heavy lanternfly infestations, when we have growers reporting 500 lanternflies on a given vine, for example, in their border rows, 5%, let's say the transmission rate's 5%, that really quickly scales up, right? So thinking about that too, because that research has been done with, I think Christina and Michaela may have looked at nymphs, but I think the transmission was mostly in adults, which is going to be late season. Thinking about an insect management approach for that, Lexi, you mentioned that when growers are managing sharpshooters, they may be maxing out their sort of systemic insecticide applications. Is that correct? Like what are growers applying for early season sharpshooter management that may also potentially be useful later for adult lanternflies?
I believe it's 4A, so imidacloprid, and Brett probably can talk a little bit more because I am getting a lot of his recommendations from him. But they are applying contact as well, they are applying. But I would say that is probably that's the most efficacious for sharpshooters is that imidacloprid or other 4A insecticides.
Yeah, just to continue with that. So we do have like two main sorts of recommendations for sharpshooters. One are using the contact like pyrethroids or carbamates, but the most effective are going to be the neonicotinoids, those systemic insecticides. And primarily it's because sharpshooters are highly mobile. So they're moving from vine to vine to the forest border to other crops. So actually trying to get them when they are active in a vineyard can be very difficult. They're also skittish. So if they see a tractor coming through or hear that the fans on a sprayer going, they'll just leave. And so getting those contact insecticides to actually contact the insects is very difficult. Not saying that they don't work, but they're more of a suppressor than a good management tool. Whereas the systemic, because they get inside the vine, as soon as the nymphs or the adults start to feed on those tissues, they bring in that insecticide and it kills them. So it's much more effective at actually reducing the numbers than those contact sprays.
Thanks, Brett. Phenologically, in terms of like when you're applying those insecticides, is that around bloom? Like how early season is that about?
Yeah, so we can with the systemics, it's a little tough because you can only use so much in one season, and that's the high rate on the label. But we can break that down into two applications of a kind of a mid-range rate and get two sprays. So you can use that around bloom and then come back in about 3 to 4 weeks later to get that second application, and that will put that into the vines and cover most of the season.
Okay. That's
and
great.
when I say put that into the vines, and so there's again another problem. I shouldn't say problem. It's another issue to be familiar with these systemics is that you can apply them foliar, so you can spray them with an air blast sprayer, and it will be taken up by the leaves, but just a little bit. A lot of it isn't as effective when you're doing the foliar. But you can also apply it as a drench or through like a fertigation or chemigation system to the soil. And so the roots will take it up much more efficiently. And so if you can apply it as a drench or through an irrigation system, you're going to get a better bang for your buck with the systemics.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and I think one thing that we have been thinking about is that as the lanternfly keeps on moving southwards, how are we going to see its life cycle change in terms of, how quickly it moves through different life stages. So my gut feeling is that, if you're already putting down systemics for sharpshooters early season, any nymphs that may be in the vineyard, you're likely going to just take care of too, right? Because that timing matches up well. And that's what we see in Virginia. If we have growers already spraying for grapefruit borer, not grapefruit borer, getting all my insect pests mixed up. Grapeberry moth, that's the one. Or even, Japanese beetle. And many times those sprays will take care of the nymph populations. But then, the systemics, as we get closer to fruit maturation and veraison, we have growers switching to contacts for lanternfly. But to Brett's point, they're highly mobile. They jump, they fly. Air blast just pushes them out of the vines too, so they're a little bit difficult. But on the topic of Pierce's disease, in each of your states, do you see, sort of thinking in maybe the last 5 to 10 years, here in Virginia, we Mizuho did a study a while ago showing the presence of Pierce's disease throughout the state, but mostly vines were potentially asymptomatic. And then the last couple of years with drought, a lot of people are seeing it in their vineyards. And there's been a renewed discussion of, how far north can it go, and even just what's the presence. In North Carolina and Georgia, are you guys seeing an increase in PD pressure as time goes on, or is it remaining static, or what's the general trend there?
So in North Carolina, I believe there's been an increase in incidents, and I have been in this position only a year, but we have been getting warmer winters. And so in that increases the risk and the incidence and the basically for it to be a chronic infection. And so we are kind of seeing it a little bit creep up a little bit more in North Carolina.
For sure. And we've been fairly limited in Georgia, just by Pierce's disease in general. So that already has definitely led most of, or not, many of the early planting discussions anyway, regardless. But it definitely has been moving up into areas that had a lot more vinifera planted that maybe are not going to be replanting with vinifera as they go through. And having to put more pressure on that. But Phil can definitely chime in on the trends more directly.
Yeah, we've looked at this over time, and I've been here for 25 years now, and it definitely is moving to higher elevations. And we record every year for our growers the temperatures that are the kind of the cardinal temperatures for the curing of the bacteria by cold in the wintertime. And just the trend line on that, as you look at it, has generally been up and really a lot up in the last few years. And as a result, we see more Pierce's disease. What I've noted over time is when you have really cold winters, which we have less and less of those, if you have 2 or 3 of those in a row, you'll see the actual amount of Pierce's disease go down, as you would expect, based on the fact that the winter temperatures kind of cure the bacteria from the vine. It probably has an impact on the vector as well, but some of it is direct against the bacteria. But yeah, it's more problematic than it was 25 years ago. Our recommendations used to be that you could plant at 1,700 foot in elevation and you'd probably be fine. I think that based on observation is no longer accurate. So I think you almost have to be above 2,000 foot in elevation in Georgia in order to get enough cold curing. And so it definitely has changed.
Thank you. Yeah, and what I wonder is I'm looking at a map of the potential distribution of spotted lanternfly in the Eastern U.S. And one thing I wonder is if basically as the further expansion of Pierce's disease maybe into more sort of these mountain areas, the Piedmont, which are also cooler and may have a higher density of the host plants like Tree of Heaven, because I think I saw a Tree of Heaven map too that pretty much mapped along the Appalachians. I'm wondering if it might potentially be a perfect storm of lanternfly suitability and Pierce's disease increasing and sort of maybe threatening some vineyards that haven't had to experience it or work with it more. And we had a question come in about what is Pierce's disease, and I see Brett's typing an answer too. But just to really quickly sort of go back another step, it's a vascular disease, so it's a disease it's a whole plant disease, but what's causing it is a bacteria that resides in the xylem, and then it proliferates in the xylem and sort of leads to xylem failure. So the classic symptoms are leaf scorching, and then it sometimes looks like drought, and the leaves will drop, and you'll get these really characteristic matchstick petioles. The petioles will remain attached, but if it goes systemic, we've heard some comments from Phil about catching an infection early enough that you can manage it. But if it goes systemic, it's most likely a fatal disease for vines. And it's difficult to manage too. Once you have it, it's a challenge. And as I mentioned, it interacts a lot with environmental conditions. So as I said, in Virginia, the bacteria is present widely, and a lot of vines may be asymptomatic, but then when they're challenged by drought and high temperatures, then maybe you start to see symptom expression. And that's a pretty well-established relationship between Pierce disease expression and drought. But yeah, if anyone has any questions in the attendees, feel free to keep on throwing them in, and we'll either answer them live or one of us will respond. Great. Okay. So yeah, I think that really sort of drives home one of the points I really wanted to talk about was the interaction between Pierce's disease and lanternfly. And as the lanternfly moves into a region that has Xylella and Pierce's disease more broadly, sort of, how we're going to approach that and manage that. One thing, even in relation to sort of late season management that I wanted to think about was, I do think that maybe in the South, we're pulling our fruit off earlier than some of our northern colleagues. For example, maybe Chardonnay is coming off in mid-August, and then, we're not getting a frost, a canopy killing frost until November. So one thing I've been thinking about is, if the lanternfly as an adult is really moving in late season into your vineyard, well, that's 2.5 months of basically management you have to do. Because even though as much as we want to harvest the fruit and celebrate being done with the season, the lanternfly is still there and we have to manage it. So I guess to my other colleagues, when is the median harvest date for when you guys are picking whites versus reds in your respective states? And really, when is also your first frost date, to sort of get an idea of how long the post-harvest window is?
We'll start to see harvesting towards the end of July, and except for muscadines, which will start pushing before that for the earlier season varieties. Most are probably going to get picked in late August, early September. Obviously, the white's generally off earlier than later. Some people will push into October when they're doing their picking. It kind of just depends. And we normally, our late season frosts often don't come until November as well. But we also have to worry about hurricanes sometimes. That has been a push in our harvest dates a little bit earlier the couple years, in the last couple years as well.
Yeah.
But that's the sort of general time trend that we're looking at.
And I'd say North Carolina follows kind of that trends. If you're in the Piedmont, which is a little bit lower elevation, it's more, it's in the middle, relative to the mountains. It's going to be like that early August, sometimes late July. That last frost date isn't till like sometimes November, early November. And then in the mountains, they can kind of push where it's going to be like in the middle of August, some depending on what they're picking for. And then and they'll try to get their reds to stay on till October in that area, but with rain seasons and hurricanes and rots, they'll pick based on that. And so and that frost a little bit earlier, maybe like the end of October, but still again like a 2-month period of post-harvest management that needs to happen.
And Drew, this may be where you're going with this, but that's one of the reasons why I think that split application of imidacloprid is going to be kind of critical to this whole process, because if you do the split application, in theory, I think, and Brett can also chime in on that, I think you'll cover those times going in even into the fall. If we're trying to do this with foliar applications, it's just going to be really, really tough. You're going to have a lot more issues, I think, than if you do the soil applied. And so I hope that will be effective. We will see, I guess, but that's kind of what I hope we can do. And then we don't have to be spraying all the time into the fall.
Yeah, on that note, I have a question for probably Brett. So, lots of growers in our area, they don't have an irrigation system. And then in the sense that that the Admire Pro's label doesn't really specify the irrigation for the ground application, soil application. So do you see much difference between if you do it from the sprayer or gun or whatever to aim for the soil versus irrigation system?
We haven't done, or I have not done any direct comparisons between the two, but in theory there shouldn't be, as long as you're able to get the chemical into the soil. So that is the biggest challenge, is if you're doing just like if you're spraying it just on the surface of the soil, is you actually need to basically water into the soil to get to the roots. And so if you apply it basically right before a rain system, or if you come in behind it and water it in, or if you're having a drench system where you can actually add more water, so you're getting nearly a gallon per vine, then you'll get plenty of that chemical to the roots to be taken up. But the key is really getting it to the roots. And so, excuse me, using something like an herbicide applicator to just spray on the surface is not going to really get it into the soil. So you need that extra water to help.
That's great. Thank you.
Brett, do you have other than imidacloprid, is like dinotefuran or other systemics labeled for grapes down there? Because that's something that we'll use post-harvest as sort of just to get some control.
Yes, yeah. So dinotefuran is another one that it works well. Imidacloprid is just the, I think, most common one. And so any of those systemic neonicotinoids are going to be effective. And I know dinotefuran is also really effective against spotted lanternfly, and so that would be a good product to use. But again, the one thing to note is that with these neonicotinoids, regardless of which one you're using, you can only use it twice. And so if you're using imidacloprid once, you could use dinotefuran once as well. You just don't want to use them. You can't use them both twice, if that makes sense.
Yes, that does. Thank you. Yeah, and I think that's something I'd like to draw attention to, is maybe just the challenges of navigating the number of uses we have for certain products for early season versus potential late season threats. And just wanted to sort of, emphasize that our growers are already trying to navigate this, and the lanternfly just may complicate it further. Yeah. Okay, so let's to pivot a little bit, I want to get Amy into this. Sorry, Amy, we're talking grapes, but I want to talk about host plants now. So I know the lanternfly is a very cosmopolitan pest that likes to feed on literally everything, right? But I know we've talked a lot about tree of heaven, but in conversations with Amy that I had last month, I learned about Chinaberry for the first time, and I sort of wanted to maybe just have people discuss the presence of tree of heaven in their state, also Chinaberry, and whether there's other sort of more southern specific hosts that we need to think about, and also if they're present around vineyards, and whether maybe growers are already managing them or not. So Amy, we'll kick it off with you.
Yeah, and I've actually got some pictures that I just pulled up to share if I can get that going. But that's something we've been talking about for a while. Can you see my screen? Let's see if it goes.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. Let me see if I can get it to. There we go. So in spotted lanternflies original native range, tree of heaven is of course a primary host, but Chinaberry is as well, where tree of heaven isn't present. And that's been documented since at least the 1950s in Chinese papers. And when we first started looking for host trees in North Carolina all the way back in 2015, we were only looking for tree of heaven to begin with. And we found that it was much more prevalent in the Piedmont, right? Kind of that more mild climate. And then I guess I can go to the next slide because it's shown anyway. But we did find that Chinaberry is a lot more prevalent in our coastal plain, and that sort of lines up with where a lot of our growers switch to having more muscadines as compared to old world grapes. And then of course in the mountains we have more things like walnuts and maples that they like to feed on as well. So we used to think that the East was kind of safe from spotted lanternfly, and that just might not be the case anymore. And that's just going to be a new kind of ecosystem that we're going to have to be managing spotted lanternfly in. And I know at this point our environmental analysis has really been focused on that control through tree of heaven, and Chinaberry hasn't quite gotten the same attention. So that's something that we're going to have to kind of navigate as southern states all together, is what that looks like for growers. I really hope that spotted lanternfly doesn't end up liking muscadines as much, but we do see a lot of them exhibiting mating behavior in native wild grapes around our Kernersville infestation area. And let me go back to that last slide. So and we have seen in Kernersville, since it is kind of at that inflection point where things start getting warmer and we start seeing more China berry, in areas where we've aggressively treated Tree of Heaven, the spotted lanternfly are moving on to some China berry that are planted there. And that actually prompted our division director, who's got a muscadine vineyard that he started to get going, to remove a whole bunch of China berry that he had right there. So that's just one of many things we're concerned about. We are seeing it feed on things like wisteria, lots of poison ivy, of course, Virginia creeper, magnolia. So it's definitely continuing to move on to new hosts all the time. Yeah, and we'll just have to see where it goes. So
Is if I can ask a question, so you said native vines you saw them feeding on. Did you identify which vines those are? Are those, yeah, do you have any comments on that?
yeah, so it's definitely some kind of grapevine. We haven't gone down to species levels to see if it's like a fox grape or a muscadine or anything like that. But the first cultivated grapevine in the US is actually in Eastern North Carolina on Roanoke Island. So we have quite a bit of muscadine just and fox grape just growing in the environment here.
Okay. How difficult is China berry to manage? Tree of Heaven is very difficult, right? To fully remove. Is China berry as difficult, or is it a bit more straightforward?
It's also kind of, it's a little later to the invasion scene. So I think Tree of Heaven started getting planted here in like the late 1700s. China berry was more like mid 1800s. So it's got 50 or so years less, but it's definitely becoming very invasive in our coastal plain area. It's got kind of a similar behavior where it likes to grow through fences and abandoned buildings and things like that. It's colonizing a lot of vacant lots and disturbed areas. So it acts very similar to Tree of Heaven.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I think you told me that we have China berry in our coastal plain in Virginia too. What about down in Georgia? Is this something that you guys see as well?
Yes, it's all over. Excuse me. I think it's more common than Tree of Heaven.
Okay. Okay, so sort of focusing maybe even on this species might be, especially if lanternflies can, you know, mature, reproduce, etc., and use them as a host, sounds like it might be a good priority moving forward then, if depending on how we approach the landscape scale management. So Amy, you mentioned muscadines, and that was another thing I wanted to bring up. And we have about how much time? I think we have like 25 minutes left. I think we're going to 12:15. But I know muscadine production is really big in North Carolina and Georgia, and we have growers producing muscadines here in Virginia as well. And my understanding is that the lanternflies, as far as research on muscadine grape species, and Julie and any of the other SLF people on the call, please feel free to interrupt me and correct me if I get this wrong. But I think they don't mature as well on muscadines compared to some other native vitis species. But one reason I want to talk about them is because, as I understand it, muscadines can be used for wine, but also are sold for juice and fresh consumption. Is that correct? In your respective states, what is the bulk production of muscadine going towards?
We'll have pretty widespread production for both fresh market and processing. So it just kind of depends. Some growers prefer one or the other, but a lot of them are doing both.
Yeah,
And
I
using
think
even cultivars for both sometimes.
North Carolina echoes that. That's pretty divided, and you can find it fresh market, processing, jams, all sorts of wine duplins here. So it ranges. I'm not sure of one or the other. I'd have to refer to Mark Hoffman for that, but
No, thank you both. Julie, I see your hands raised. You want to chime in?
Yeah, just following up on that. I don't have a sense of the scale of muscadine production. Like, are they harvested with a mechanized harvester, or is it handpicked mostly?
They'll also have both. If you have processing muscadines, they're more likely to be machine harvested, at least if you've got a large enough scale. Fresh market is a little bit harder to do a machine harvest, but especially because it has a much longer ripening period, so you often have to do multiple harvests off of those table grape, especially muscadines. But you will see some mechanical harvesting done as well.
Can you give us a scale of the total acreage of muscadines, like relative to your vinifera or just vitis hybrid plantings? What is sort of the differences there?
Muscadines make up the vast majority of our vineyards in Georgia. Most of them are more concentrated in the south. There are some muscadine vineyards in the northern part of the state, but those are going to be smaller. Most of our bunch grape producers are going to have acreage less than 20 acres for their production, and are going to be more concentrated in the north part of the state, northeast part of the state especially. And then our muscadine producers, again, all over the place, but more concentrated further south. And there's lots of people, lots of backyard muscadine producers, but also growers up to about 800 acres as well.
Is that but Lexi, before you comment really quickly, is that you say 800 acres, is it how big or how large is the contiguous blocks of muscadines? Do you get something up to, I don't know what the terrain's like down there, so do you sort of max out at like 3 or 4 acres per block, or do you just have sort of like Lake Erie style, like big tracts of muscadines?
You can have pretty big tracts of muscadines. They're fewer and farther between the very large producers, and many of them have multiple sites. But several of those producers have at least, I want to say, often it's not unusual to have at least a 20-acre swath of muscadines. Those are often further separated from each other, so you'll have large blocks, very large blocks of muscadines, and then it'll be, a good several miles before you get to the next grower, that kind of situation. But not necessarily true for all cases, but definitely some larger swaths for sure.
Thanks, Sarah. Lexi, what about up in North Carolina? And I know Mark does more of the muscadine stuff, but whatever you can comment on would be great.
yeah, I can't comment on the acreage, but I'd say like probably like it's like the state split in half essentially, like on the East Coast, in the coastal areas of North Carolina, it's all muscadines. As you start moving west, you start having muscadines and bunch grapes or vitis vinifera and hybrids. And then as you start going, continue west and higher in elevation, we have vitis vinifera and then hybrids, just to do with the cold. But I think it's about like 50-50 when we like kind of look at it as a whole. Mark has done frequency of plantings and not so much gathering acreage, but it seems like it's about 50-50, I would say, for that. And it's split up because of the topography of North Carolina.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. And Virginia is the same thing too. Most of the growers growing muscadines are in the coastal plain or the southern part of the state where it's a little bit warmer. So what about insect management for muscadines? I guess this is a two-part question. First part, are your muscadine growers managing for the same insect pests that you mentioned, grapefruit borer, that your bunch grape growers are managing? And then the second part is for some of these larger muscadine growers, are they part of co-ops or any type of larger company that may have specific spray guidelines or restrictions?
muscadines, they're much less worried about a lot of pests. Brett can probably go into more details, but other than grape root borer, which tends to be a larger problem, but not necessarily a heavily managed until you start having problems and realizing you're having problems. But few, like you can see some insects that are just going to be much less prevalent on muscadines. In the research block that we have, a bunch of muscadines and a bunch of bunch grapes, and all of the, like, you can get Japanese beetles on your muscadines, but they always are going to go over to my bunch grapes and eat those first. So you can see them feeding on it and some of the same insect pathogens, but they don't, or insect pests, they don't tend to be as problematic on the muscadines.
Yeah, I would agree. The grape root borer is probably the most problematic, but it's also not as managed as it would be in bunch grapes. And then Japanese beetles are only really a concern on young, newly established vines for muscadine. We do get mites and leafhoppers, but the leafhoppers are mainly just kind of stippling of the leaves. They're not really causing issues with Pierce's disease in this case. So it's still relatively minor. Muscadine are fantastic when it comes to insect pests.
Do you so in that case then, like the amount of sprays, products that you're putting down is a lot less relative to bunch grapes?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. What about for the processing growers? Would something, because I know with the lanternfly, with wine grapes, maybe the honeydew component on the fruit is not something we're as concerned about relative to someone selling grapes in a fresh market. Are there pretty stringent, I guess, guidelines or demands for clean fruit? I know obviously there probably is, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is, would, even if the lanternfly can't necessarily, maybe it doesn't like muscadines as much theoretically, but if it does feed and produces honeydew on the fruit, do you think that could be a potential threat to marketable fruit, the fresh markets or processing?
I would say yes. While muscadines in comparison tend to be much lower input in general, having a good looking product for those table grapes especially is going to be very important. A lot of that is hand sorted and hand picked a lot of times, which a lot of the other tasks that are done in those vineyards can be heavily mechanized, but yeah, that would be problematic if there was either just sooty mold growing on the fruit, or what have you. So it being in the muscadine vineyards would be certainly problematic if they're going to feed on any scale.
Okay. Same thing for North Carolina, Lexi, do you think?
Yeah, it would be mostly the problem with the fresh market, like Sarah was saying, just with the honeydew and sap. So yeah.
Okay. What about so thinking about a management perspective, what would be the impact of, like, let's say with the adult lanternflies, they need to put on like 1 to 2 additional sprays. Is that something that you think your muscadine growers and your bunch grape growers can both weather, or are the margins very, very tight and that's sort of might be a real challenge for some production?
I'd say for the Vitis vinifera growers, adding more sprays might not be ideal. I believe that their profit margins and whatnot are pretty slim. Muscadine growers, I would assume, I mean, adding any sprays isn't great for growers. They don't want to do that. But I think muscadines with their limited inputs, I think would be able to. I don't know if anyone would enjoy it though.
I'm sure no one's looking to spray more. And what about sort of I'm sorry, I'm asking so many questions about muscadines, both for the audience, but also for myself too, because this is a new sort of aspect of viticulture for me, admittedly. What about the sort of the total tonnage coming off muscadine vineyards? Do they tend, at least the ones for processing maybe too, and even for wine, does it tend to be sort of a maximalist approach, or is it sort of more like maybe the bunch grape approach where there's different management styles that you do to try to achieve like a balanced yield production?
A lot of times they're going to try to get what they can get, kind of the max potential they could get from those. Muscadines in general can be very low input, and especially some of those larger producers are going to, especially even if they're doing a little more hand harvesting, doing a lot of mechanized pruning, which is going to impact, and that will reduce your yield over time. But they're trying to get as much fruit as they can off of their blocks for sure. And even some of our newer cultivars, there are more dioecious muscadines, so you can have female plants that you need a pollinator for. That's still some of the cultivars that they're still producing, but some of the newer trends are for more self-fertile, but also very large fruited varieties that we see a lot more issues with potential overcropping problems, which has been a fun problem to try to get to people to address, and they don't really want to. But yeah, it's an interesting, but they're trying to get as much fruit as they possibly could off of those acreage while still doing the least amount of work.
Okay. Okay. I see. No, I think this is helpful because I think even just thinking about where lanternfly is expanding in other regions and sort of expanding into different grape commodity markets like juice grapes or processing grapes, for Labrusca up in, the Lake Erie belt, it seems to me like there might be some similarities, even though they're two different grape species, at least the production styles might be more similar between those systems, and some of the potential implications of lanternfly presence in terms of, additional sprays, but potential impacts to fruit marketability or even, challenges with, what's the word, mechanization, mechanical harvesting, even like mechanized pruning and sort of that scale. So I think that's, to all of our northern colleagues, that's something that maybe we could all sort of work on together and think about, because I think there might be some real kind of interesting overlaps for research and work. Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, so thanks for all those comments about muscadines. I think that might have answered all my questions. Julie, I see your hand up.
Okay, so this might be getting like beyond muscadines. I don't know if you have other questions, but something that's come up with the talk about systemics. And again, I'll preface this with, I'm not a viticulture person, but it sounds to me, and some talking with Brian Walsh here and direct messages, it sounds, and so maybe this is for Drew, Phil, and Brian. It sounds to me like you're using, to control the sharpshooters, especially because they're so skittish, which is really interesting, that you all are using drip irrigation to apply your systemics, right? And it kind of sounds to me, or maybe it seems like that's not really what we see in our growers in Southeastern Pennsylvania in terms of how they deal with lanternfly. So kind of that's one question. And the other question then is kind of Drew and Brian, my understanding is that the amount of dino, for example, that you could apply to grapevines is a much lower rate than we would, you would use in an ornamental, right? And so is dino going to be effective? Like what Phil talked about, if you could, apply your, and Brett, good to see Brett, that if you have your either imidacloprid or dinotefuran allocation spread across 2 applications, right? Whichever, if it's one of each or one of whichever one, is that second application going to be effective against an insect as large as an adult lanternfly? So those are my questions out to you all, because it seems like this application with these systemics is kind of another regional difference. But is that correct?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Because it with those split applications, it is enough to kill a sharpshooter, which is a fraction of the size of a lanternfly. So I don't know. That's a really good one. I unfortunately do not know if it's going to be enough to kill a lanternfly, especially an adult. I hope so. But yeah, that will be something we'll definitely need to look at.
Like, Drew, do you know that? Or Brian, that was kind of inspired. That was your question too, but maybe do you have other data, Drew or Brian?
Yeah, and I may loop Mizuho in too, based on his experiences, but I think we sprayed in our own research vineyard, after harvest, we put down, I want to say we did dinotefuran, and this is totally anecdotal, so take it with a grain of salt. There were lanternfly, the length of control after that wasn't nearly as long as I expected. We had more lanternflies moving back in and feeding that weren't dead faster than I would have anticipated spraying in a systemic like that. And I'm pretty sure I'm trying to look it up while I'm also speaking. Yes, I'm pretty sure we did do dinotefuran. But yeah, Brian, do you have any comments?
No, it's just the rate that is used in a vineyard is so much lower per plant than what we would do in an ornamental application. Ornamental application, dinotefuran is very effective, months of control, much higher rate of active ingredient being put per tree. And what I don't come from the vineyards, and the initial work was brief. The initial research work with this was brief. The adults can handle a larger dose than the nymphs. When we did applications area wide, we did foliar applications with nymphs in a park setting, and it nuked them. It absolutely nuked them. When we went back and tried to do it with adults, it did not have the same impact. They were moving right back in and feeding. They may have been, I wouldn't even say moribund. They were a little bit stupid, but they weren't dying. They were still going on feeding. So I think that is a point where further research really needs to be looked at. Is if you're going to use neonics, what's the efficacy, duration, and just the overall evaluation with adults versus the nymphs, and it's the application method and AI concentrations. Vineyard is very, very different from ornamental. But the other thing I'll say with the imidacloprid, what we've seen over and over again is that imidacloprid done as a foliar over the top is extremely effective, incredibly effective also with adults, but the duration drops off. When we've seen, the homeowner, everybody goes to the box store and buys imidacloprid and dumps it on the ground for the trees, the uptake is very slow, and we also don't see dead pile up as they do when the foliar applications are made. So the application method, at least with imidacloprid, seems very different in the efficacy outcome as well. We don't have that stuff worked out in the insecticide trials that we did actually do. Those things weren't teased out. We were running fast and throwing things quickly to see what worked in the early beginnings, and really these things need to be followed up.
And I'll just say, I think what we're having is more hope than anything else at this point, because, we're just hopeful we don't have to change anything at the Southeast, and we can use what we've been using for sharpshooters. But now you've effectively terrified me. So anyhow, that's kind of where we are.
But I think this is great. I kind of feel like, Drew, by your genius of having this group of folks, we're kind of catching, you're thinking of it before the growers even are. So I feel like we got even a bit ahead of it compared to what we did in having the grower panel last year, that you're thinking of these things, and we're trying to, foresee these problems in advance. So I think I'm sorry you're terrified, but I'm glad you're concerned. Yeah, you know.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, I guess that's the goal, is to be optimistic but prepared and cautious, I suppose. Yeah. Mizuho, I saw that you unmuted. Did you have a comment you wanted to add?
No, no, I totally agree with what you and then Brian mentioned. So we did use that dianotepion a couple of times in the last 3 or 4 years. It did work when we were hitting it, but after that we didn't see much, residual effect from that our 4-year spray.
And the one other comment I would make in listening to this conversation, your harvest dates with the muscadines, I guess, saying July into August, that is really early. And the fact that you have existing that early, that far south, where we don't really see those adults till end of July, I think you might actually be facing a longer period of them invading the vineyards, which would mean probably more than those 2 or 3 additional sprays. So sorry, but more bad news potentially. It might be 3 or 4 sprays, and also your kill date is going to be way later than ours. So, I mean, the freeze out date when the adults are done. So you're not going to be able to let them continue to feed until they freeze uninhibited without seeing. So you may have a more than just 2 applications to add into your regimen.
It sounds like we might be hitting them foliarly and from the ground in some ways. If we do the things we might have to do, that might be the reality. Mustang Max and those things that we would apply for sour rot, are they going to have pretty good activity?
Sure, but it's a Mustang Max is Zeta cypermethrin. It's a 1-day knockdown at best. And the reason that the growers here like it so much is it's a 1-day PHI. So they can spray, they can clean out what's there on the vines and then harvest. But the longer duration synthetic pyrethroids, they do get up to 2 weeks, sometimes a little bit longer out of them, but your PHIs are greatly extended. So it becomes what we have deemed the chess game of which product when to your anticipated harvest date. Just trying to fit those PHIs together with the duration of efficacy.
Yeah, and I will say too, in terms of phenology, we are of course seeing adults come out a lot earlier. This past year, we saw them in like the last third of June, started coming out around, I think, just before the 20th. We still saw egg hatch around the same time as the other states, like maybe it's driven by photoperiod rather than temperature, but that could change as the new populations adapt to the warmer temperatures. We don't know. So just wanted to throw that in there too.
And Amy, to that point, I wonder too, like what the vineyard sort of invasion timing would be, because we like here at our research vineyard, because I was doing experiments, I was collecting them from the woods around our blocks, and they were all there, and they were like, I was waiting for them. I was like, when are they going to move into the vineyards? And Mizuho and I kept on being like, we see them, they're congregating, but like, when's it going to happen? And then all of a sudden, again, and you all may know more than me, something switched, and then like, bam, here they all come. And that's what we heard from growers too. I didn't hear anything from much of my Virginia growers until pretty much when Hurricane Helena came through. And it was like right then they all just moved in. So I do even wonder, in addition to that advanced maturation, like where is the vineyard entering component going to be? And is that going to be accelerated too? Or hopefully not. Maybe they'll just hang out on all the China berry and the tree of heaven and just deplete those and instead of the vines. But yeah, I guess this is something we need to focus on. And even from the viticultural side, having that longer post-harvest feeding window, all of the research in vineyards that I think has been done to date with Michaela and others, we haven't really looked at like post-harvest infestations. We have infested the vines through harvest, but really, just trying to look at, well, what happens, maybe you don't see impacts to bricks that year, but maybe you're still seeing a potential yield reduction or even reductions in storage carbohydrates if you're having that long window. So that's something I know I'm personally thinking about from the vineyard side that I hope to research soon. But yeah,
Can I add to that? Because this is a question I have. Can I add to
Sure.
that? Okay. So from the Pierce's disease discussion, right? I heard you all were saying that, okay, drought stress can induce expression of, if Xylella is there but dormant, it can induce expression of Pierce's disease. Could feeding by lanternfly, like let's say, like not even considering lanternfly transmitting, right? Could feeding by lanternfly do the same thing and induce expression of dormant PD? And could that be what you see happening, like by that extended post-harvest period of feeding?
I'm going to try to take a stab at that in the sense that it's not really that it's dormant. It's just that the drought stress brings it out quicker, I think is what I would say. It's actually, you're seeing the results of having the xylem clogged more rapidly when you have drought stress. If these reduce the amount of moisture actually in the vine, if you want to look at it that way, by their feeding behavior, I think you could exacerbate Pierce's disease in some way. And there may be a stress by Xylella, which is the bacteria type interaction of some kind. So I guess it's really hard to say whether it's going to mimic the same thing you get with drought. But if it does in any way mimic what you get with drought relative to reducing the level of water in the plant, and especially in the xylem, it could be possible.
Yeah, Phil, to follow up on that, that's my feeling too. Michaela and I had a recent paper looking at sort of whole vine water use. And what we saw was that the vines under heavy and uncontrolled infestation were reducing their overall water use. So their transpiration was lower. And that was measured via sap flow sensors. But we also had point dendrometers that measure the radial expansion of the trunk. So just think of it expanding and contracting during the day. And the data from that we interpreted as the lanternflies were extracting enough water potentially via the sap to sort of be affecting the whole plant water balance. And that's something that Michaela and I are working on further. And we want to actually do some modeling to look at the water budget because, it's not just drought. They're injecting all sorts of hormones and all sorts of other things are happening. So it's really difficult to say, or I guess to hypothesize that it could be, inducing, I guess, further stress. But it is one more, regardless, it is one more additive stress onto your vine. So even from the management point of view, I would tell growers, if you already have vines that are diseased, whether Pierce's disease, leaf roll, any vascular pathogen, focus on them a bit more in terms of your management, or at least be wary. So if they are infested, they might not be able to tolerate the infestation as well.
And I think this came up also at another point. We're talking about other diseases, but we don't know, I don't think for sure what's going to happen with something like crown gall. The damage that's being done here is probably a much more aggressive damage than we've seen with some of the insects in the past. So you may see something associated with that bacteria also in interaction with these, but I don't know. Have y'all seen that at all yet so far, Drew, or do you know?
I might kick this to Julie or Mizuho, but my understanding, yeah, Mizuho, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so we had the same question. So we actually put the proposal to our wine board to investigate on that. So we'll see how it goes. But if the lanternfly can transmit a bacterial pathogen, I wouldn't be too surprised. They can do the other one too. So and then they are feeding on the location where the crown gall typically shows up too. And then Drew mentioned that some of the grower actually did mention that after heavy feeding, it seems like a crown gall kind of shows up here and there. But of course, we don't know the cause and relationship, because we don't have actual experiment to conduct. But that's something we're thinking about doing this summer.
Thanks, Mizuho. All right, so I'm getting the note that we have officially moved past our time and we're now into our scheduled break. it sounds like there is going to be an open discussion time after 1:30. So if anyone has any other questions, I'll try my best to come back at that time and be around. But yeah, thanks to all the attendees for tuning in for this, and thanks to all the panelists too for coming together and making this happen. This was a nice way to feature our region and sort of talk about some things we're thinking about. So thank you, everybody. And thanks to Julie too for the invitation originally, and Jacob and Brian.
Great job, you guys. Thank you so much.